Good evening, everyone. My name is Mary Anderson. I am one of your librarians, and I'm also a historian. So this evening, our musicians are singing from manuscripts from a monastery in northern Spain, thought to be date back to the 15th century. And I just want to give you a little bit of context for this. This is the story of these manuscripts begins long before the date of them. Others this evening will be talking about the music, the liturgical practices, but I would like to set the stage for you all by telling you a bit about the monastic life, how creating manuscripts became part of that life, and how this fits into the medieval world. So the image of monks diligently copying manuscripts is one that is part of our popular culture. From movies like In the Name of the Rose, based on the novel by Umberto Eco, to television commercials for copiers, to comics like this one where darn the copier is down again. The monk diligently copying has become an image in our culture. But how did this activity become associated with monastic life? As a historian and librarian, I feel I must give you a bit of context. So let me just take a few minutes to cover, 1,000 years of history. So monasticism had its beginnings in Eastern Christianity. When the Roman Emperor Constantine legalized Christianity and the church found itself no longer persecuted, but now in a place of privilege, there were those who faced existential questions. When the church joins with worldly powers, how does one adjust? How is one to witness to Christ crucified when church leaders live in a life of luxury and the ultimate witness of martyrdom no longer exists? The answer to the question for some was the monastic life. They fled from human society, they left everything behind, and they sought to dominate what they saw as the bodily passions, and seeking to live a life of the monastic ideal. It should be noted that this ascetic life was not invented at this time. There were long roots dating back even into Judaism, of living simple lives, of widows not marrying after marriage. So this is a long tradition beyond this time. As they fled, there are those who, the early monks lived alone. They were known as anchorite monks, which means simply withdrawn or fugitive. St. Anthony here is traditionally seen as the first of these monks, though it is important to remember that this is a broad movement. He was not the only one, but we like to give people credit for things. And so he was one of the first to withdraw to the desert to live this holy life. But one of the problems was that even if you withdrew to the desert, people followed you there. There were those who wanted to learn from these folks who had the first to go. There were those who were curious about them, and there were those who sought to seek help from these people who were seen as holy. So this desire to learn from others gradually formed a new type of monasticism called Cenobite monasticism, which simply means communal. As the case with the solitary monks, it's hard to pinpoint who exactly began this movement, but Pachomius is a 3rd century monk who was seen as now the father of this communal form of monasticism in Eastern Christianity. Those who joined him agreed to give up all their worldly goods, to live a very disciplined life, to live in obedience to their superiors. The ultimate focus of their life was Scripture, And part of that was memorizing large passages. All of the Psalms, much of the New Testament was memorized. They used it in prayer, they used it in meditation, and even as they worked, they would also recite these passages. So it was just woven into their experience. But in order to do this, in order to memorize these texts, they had to have the text. So this is where we get into the manuscripts and where copying manuscripts starts to come in. In order to memorize the text, you had to have text. As these manuscripts, though, come to us from Spain, so Western Christianity rather than East. So I want to tell you a little bit about that as well. Early Western monasticism basically modeled Eastern, but eventually they would need someone to give Western monasticism its own flavor, its own take. And that person was Benedict. We know him best, if anyone knows him, by his rule. Benedict's rule is simply a list of precepts for life together as monks. This rule shaped Western monasticism during its beginnings, but also even into today. So it is Benedict where that's really shaped the monastic life as we know it in many contexts. Benedict's version of monasticism differed from the East in a few ways. The Eastern monks, again, were much more focused on discipline, but while this was part of Benedict's life, Benedict's rule, all things are in moderation for Benedict. So it is a balance that he tried to achieve. One both prayed and worked. And like the Eastern monks, it was a combination. So again, scripture too was important, reciting scripture as part of prayer. But for Benedict, study was also an explicit part of the rule. So here again is where the manuscripts become important in order to study, in order to read. Reading manuscripts, particularly during Lent, was an explicit part of the rule. And so in order to do that, you had to have books. And so though he doesn't specify the copying of these books as part of the monastic life, it is implicit in those parts of the rule. In early commentaries on his rule, we do see that copying manuscripts is part of the communal life of the monks. It's explicitly said. The other part where copying manuscripts comes into the rule is within his emphasis on physical labor. This was initially seen as a focus on agriculture, but ultimately, creating a manuscript is indeed physical labor. So the process of creating these is quite fascinating. Most of them were written on animal skin rather than paper. Paper didn't come into the common use until the late 15th century. So they used animal skins. Many of the calf skin was the most prominent of these and is known as vellum. So here's a modern version of this process. The skins were first soaked in lime to remove the hair and any flesh. And then they would be scraped, and then they would be bleached and stretched, and this was a multiple-day process that would occur. So they'd bleach them, stretch them, bleach them, stretch them, until they were thin enough as desired. After that, the next process was ruling them, that is, writing lines. You in the back probably can't see this, but on this page, you can see the rule lines that were put in there And this actually comes from the largest book here. You can still see them today. So they would put the straight lines in so that the scribe would could line up the text properly. And then once those were done, it would become time to write the text, or in the case of these, the musical notes as well. And they used a quill. That's an example of a quill from the 15th century, so a little later from our time. These are made out of goose or feathers frequently. Unlike our common picture of these quills with the plume coming out, they actually usually chop those off, so they're very boring looking from our perspective. So that's what they would use to write. Some of them would be illuminated, that is decorated with colored ink, as well as precious metals like gold or silver. The next step was binding, and so they were, the sheets were folded, they were put together in what were called gatherings. These were then bound with leather thongs or string, and then put together with boards. You can kind of see that here, and I think you'll see that of the books as well, and then covered in leather. So this was not an easy process, as you can tell. This took years to accomplish. So one did not come to this task lightly. And you can see they produce good work. We still have them today. So it is from these early days of monasticism that these texts have their origin, ultimately. Western monasticism didn't come into its own in the same way that Eastern did. It actually came after the fall of the Roman Empire. And as a result, it came at a time where the monasteries ended up being a central area for the medieval life. So they became not only centers of libraries, but centers of education, of agriculture, of economics, of culture. So they had a very central place within society. But as we get into the High Middle Ages, around the year 1000, the monasteries start to lose their central place as political leaders gain more stability. It's a time of growth and expansion. Cities now become the center of society rather than monasteries. It's the time of the university, so they are more and more becoming the intellectual center. With the university is also one of the first times that we see the movement of book production go out of the monasteries as books become part of university life and serving the lay public as well. But this time was followed by a time of decline. You may have heard of the Black Death or the bubonic plague. This was especially a troubling part of the 14th century. There was also disarray in the church at this time. The Great Schism occurred, where there were at one time 3 popes. But even after that, as we enter the 15th century, the time of these books, is yet another time of massive change. In Spain, the Catholic rulers, Ferdinand and Isabel, finally expelled the Moors who had ruled in parts of Spain for centuries. They are also at this time sponsoring Columbus in what would be seen as the beginning of the age of discovery in some perspectives. This is also the time of the Renaissance, when folks would look back on this medieval period I've just been talking about, and the age of monasticism, and name it the Dark Ages. They would look back instead to the Greek and Roman classics, the poets, the rhetoricians. They emphasized knowledge, wisdom over knowledge, and beauty and eloquence. This is what they saw as important. And these monks were just backward folks. So the most important transition, though, and for the sake of manuscripts, though, was the revolution of Johannes Gutenberg and his movable type press. This would ultimately lead to the end of most manuscript production. So this is a time of the time of these manuscripts is a time of great change, and so I think it's very appropriate that we should use these manuscripts as part of a program that seeks to bring both the past and the present together.